My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and recently I was thinking about differences between the Lord of the Rings movies that Peter Jackson did and the original books, and I was thinking about Bree, and I realized even though the scene in Bree kind of encapsulates a lot of the things that happen in the book, the movie actually leaves out a ton of stuff, and if you really pay attention to all the extra stuff, it's a much richer scene. And so what I want to do in this video is kind of compare the two, kind of discuss which elements of the scene the movie leaves out and why that kind of tends to be important to the story. So I'm going to go over kind of three major themes. I'm going to go over Aragorn's role in that scene, Butterbur's role in that scene, and just kind of the overall feel of Bree and the Prancing Pony itself, because all three of those kind of play a very unique role and get very definitely shifted in the movie as compared to the book. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is the overall feel of Bree and the Prancing Pony, because in the movie, of course, you get this very dingy town of Bree, and then the inside of the Prancing Pony Inn is very dark and grungy, and just kind of it's designed to make it feel very uncomfortable, and especially for the hobbits, because the hobbits are very, they're on the run. It's just kind of continuing that idea of they're in a foreign world of big people and all this stuff. And there's a sense in which that's kind of true, but what the movie kind of leaves out is that in the book, Bree is really more of a transitional chapter. I mean, there's a long transitional period sort of in the book that kind of starts with Tom Bombadil and the Barrow Wights and all that stuff. If you haven't read the books and don't know what I'm talking about, I'll do a video on those eventually. But Bree is kind of like the last major place where they feel in any sense at home, because there are hobbits in Bree, and that's why Butterbur has hobbit-sized rooms. In fact, occasionally it says in the Lord of the Rings that hobbits, especially from the Took and Brandybuck families who are more adventurous than most, occasionally actually travel to Bree and visit. It's like the most adventurous thing just about any regular hobbit ever does. Point being, in the movie they walk in and Butterbur brings up the fact that they have hobbit-sized rooms. And yet in the movie you see no hobbits, no other indication of anything hobbit-like in Bree, and that makes it seem a little weird. It's like there's just, in the movie you really don't get any idea that there's any hobbits outside of the Shire, and they never leave the Shire. So why are there hobbit rooms in this inn? Well, that's why. And in the book it's a lot different, because they show up. Bree is not a terrible looking town. There's actually hobbit holes built into the hill, and so there's still some hominess to it. And when they walk into the inn itself, there's hobbits in the inn. In fact, one of the people who is employed at the inn is a hobbit. There's actually two. And so there's still some of that homey feel. The inside of the inn is not, a dark dungeon look that's going to terrify the hobbits. It's probably more similar to what they would be familiar with the Green Dragon and other stuff like that. So, and if you read the book overall, you also kind of start to notice that there's a shift in the tone. Of course, when Tolkien started writing The Lord of the Rings, it was written originally as a sequel to The Hobbit, and then it just kind of took on a life of its own, and it shaped The Hobbit more than The Hobbit shaped it. And I've done a video on a little bit of that I'll link to, about how Tolkien retconned the Hobbit story. I'll link to that below so you can kind of get an idea of just how much this story impacted The Hobbit rather than the other way around. So the interesting thing about it is, for the first several chapters in the book, you still have a little bit of that feel of the Hobbit, which is a little more lighthearted, a little more what we would think of as written for children as opposed to written for adults. And you still get a little bit of that in Bree, even though by this point you've already experienced the Barrow Wights, which is pretty terrifying, and some other stuff that's, the ring wraiths are after them. So you've got a little bit of, real terror going on. But you still get little hints of just, lightheartedness and whatnot all the way up until Bree. After Bree, that kind of stops. This is really the transitional phase. And the way that happens in the book is Frodo ends up singing a song, which Tolkien, naturally putting everything in terms of this is a prehistory to our own world, is basically putting forward as this is the original of the Cow Jumped Over the Moon rhyme. and he basically extends it out into this big story about a moon, the man in the moon coming to this inn to drink ale. He gets drunk. The sun comes up, and everybody's still in bed, and he's like, what just happened? It's because there's this huge party where the moon got drunk, and everybody was trying to get the moon back into the chariot to take him back to the sky. And, it's a really fun rhyme. If you have a copy, you should just read it again just for the fun of it. But the point is that there's still some of that lightheartedness. Tolkien has Frodo sing this song as a way of kind of interrupting Pippin from talking about him being Baggins and all this, because in the movie they just kind of very quickly skip to that. Frodo just kind of wakes out of the ring trance, so to speak, and hears Pippin talking about Baggins. And that's another funny thing too. In the movie, he just makes up the Underhill name on the spot when Butterbur asks for his name. In the book, Gandalf actually tells Frodo to go by that name as he's traveling before he ever leaves Hobbiton. So there's kind of a difference there too. But anyway, the point being, all the way up until now, you still get little bits of lightheartedness. Bree is kind of the last leg of the journey where the hobbits have anything home-like, anything to remind them of home. Everything after this point is pretty much just dead serious. And so instead, Peter Jackson's movie kind of just makes it, we're jumping headlong into the world of men, the big people, and it's dark, and it's grungy, and hobbits are terrified. And that's not really the way it works in the book, because it's in the book, of course, there's a lot more that gets left out, and it's a much slower progression getting the hobbits into an uncomfortable territory, which makes sense. I mean, in the book you have a lot more time for that. In the movie, if they had included everything that kind of transitions the hobbits from, Bag End to Rivendell, you would have another hour's worth of movie material, and there's probably no way they could have gotten a producer or a film studio to do that. But that's kind of the background of Bree and how the theme and the feel of Bree and the Prancing Pony itself really plays into the story and how it kind of affects the overall feel of the story. So now let's kind of talk about Butterbur's role, because he's kind of a linchpin in the plot, but in the movie that kind of gets left out. So let's take a look at that. So in the movie, Butterbur plays a very, 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 very small role. He basically welcomes the hobbits, tells them they have hobbit-sized rooms, gives them a table, kind of sort of tells them who Strider is to the extent that he knows anything, which is very little. And that's also true in the book as well. He doesn't really know much of anything about Strider. What doesn't really come out in the movie is that he has a very, very profound distrust of Strider. He's not really sure who he is, so I'm kind of, I'm scared of what I don't know. He actively distrusts Strider and all Rangers. He just thinks that they're kind of vagabonds, ruffians. Of course, he doesn't know any better, but that kind of comes along later. The more important thing is, in the book, Butterbur was actually supposed to have sent Frodo a letter written by Gandalf so that he would tell him, leave the Shire now. And this was months prior to when Frodo actually left the Shire. Butterbur, being the forgetful sort that he is, his mind is a sieve. Totally forgot about the letter, never sent it. He ends up remembering it before Frodo leaves and gives it to him, and that plays a role in the whole situation with Aragorn, which I'll get to in a little bit later. But the movie, Butterbur's supposed to be this really forgetful person, and that's part of what makes his character a little bit humorous. In the movie, the only hint at that forgetfulness is when Frodo brings up Gandalf's name and he says, Gandalf. Oh, yeah, I remember. And he goes into the elderly chap, big gray beard, pointy hat. And Frodo's like, yeah. And then he says he hasn't been here for 6 months. Well, you could put that down to Butterbur just doesn't really know who Gandalf is. And since he was only there 6 months ago, well, not surprising that he forgot. But in reality, Butterbur knows exactly who Gandalf is, because lots of people know who Gandalf is. Butterbur is actually a person of some importance in the town because he keeps the inn, and so Gandalf makes a point of knowing him, and therefore Butterbur also knows Gandalf. And you don't really get the idea that he forgot Gandalf because he's forgetful. If you've read the books, that's kind of what they're hinting at, but you just don't, you don't really get the idea that he's forgetful per se. He's just doesn't remember who he's talking about. But what's really interesting, though, is the whole situation with Butterbur is actually a lot more complex in the book, because Butterbur, he actually gives them a room, and the room itself is where he gives them their meal. They don't enter the common room until later. Interestingly enough, by the way, Merry doesn't ever come into the common room. He actually goes for a walk, ends up encountering a Black Rider slash Nazgul. They haven't been calling him Nazgul up to that point in the story, though, and faints. Luckily, somebody comes along before the Nazgul can do anything nasty to him, rescues him, and he gets brought in later after Frodo is already talking to Aragorn back in the Hobbit's rooms. So the only three people in the common room are actually Frodo, Sam, and Pippin. So Butterbur this whole time is kind of just doing his thing, being a landlord. He does explain a little bit about Strider to Frodo, and then there's a little bit more interaction there than in the movie, but it's not a lot more until you really get into the part where Aragorn starts to make his role known and gets into that. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this part with Butterbur now, because if I talk any more about Butterbur, I'm going to have to talk about Aragorn, so I might as well just get to Aragorn and wrap it all up. So let's do that. So Aragorn, of course, is another part where they really kind of shorten up a lot of the narrative and just kind of condense it for the purpose of speed. Because in the book, there's actually a lot of interaction between Aragorn and Frodo, both before and after Frodo accidentally puts on the ring. And the way that happens in the book, going back to that song that Frodo sings, that's the cow jumped over the moon rhyme, he actually sings it twice, and on the second time, when the cow jumps over the moon, Frodo jumps, and he's on a table at this point because he's short, so he has to get up to a high point for people to see him, falls down, the table crashes, and that's when the ring gets on his finger because he has his hands in his pockets. It's not this, oops, it goes way up in the air and then just magically lands just right. So it actually happens after he's already talked to Aragorn a bit, because, which of course he only knows him as Strider at this point. Butterbur points out who Strider is, and he's looking at him and thinking, who is this guy? Aragorn actually motions him over, and so he goes to sit with him. Now, that may seem really weird in the context of the movie, because everybody in Bree and the Prancing Pony seems like either a thug or a creep or just a weird guy. And Aragorn doesn't really give off a healthy vibe either, because he's got his hood on, you can't really see him. He's a mysterious character, and you would never go up to somebody. But in the book, of course, you have to remember there's hobbits in the common room. Everybody looks kind of normal. It's not this dark, dingy place. So it's not as weird as you would think. Frodo goes over there. They start having a conversation. Aragorn is actually the one who points out the fact that Pippin is about to make a blunder and reveal who Frodo is. So the conversation they have initially is just kind of not really getting at a lot of substantive material. Aragorn is just kind of feeling him out a little bit. Frodo is trying to figure out who this guy is. But Aragorn is making it clear, I know something, and we're going to have a relationship here. And then, of course, they get interrupted by Pippin almost giving away Frodo's identity. The whole ring incident happens. Frodo rolls back over to Aragorn's table and starts talking to him again. Aragorn says, now, why did you do that? That was the stupidest thing you could have done. I was trying to get you to prevent him from giving something away, and you just gave away the biggest thing of all. And Frodo, of course, as in the movie, tries to play it off like, I don't know what you're talking about. But, of course, Aragorn's like, I know what you're carrying. I'm kind of involved in the same thing. I'll meet you in your room, and we'll discuss the fact that I'm going to have to take you out of Bree and to Rivendell because it's way too dangerous. And Frodo's like, at that point, Frodo is basically thinking that he's kind of fallen in with a ruffian who's just going to take advantage of him through violence or the threat thereof, because he doesn't really know who Aragorn is. So anyway, after they get done in the common room, after Frodo kind of like tries to appease everybody as to some explanation for why he disappeared into thin air, they do go back to the common room, and at this point, of course, it's still just Frodo, Sam, and Pippin. Merry is still outside, being either scared by or rescued from the ring wraiths. So they go back into the room. Aragorn is already there, just kind of sitting in the shadows, and they don't even notice him at first. And then when they do notice him, it's like, whoa, didn't know you were here. So anyway, they start talking, Aragorn, of course, is trying to convince them, you're going to need me to make it all the way to Rivendell. The Black Riders are on your tail. The people in Bree now know who you are. And I will say this, even though I said that, the inn was not full of a bunch of crazy creeps and whatever, there were a few people in there that attracted attention. One was a squint-eyed or slant-eyed southerner, and the other was a guy named Bill Ferny. The Bill Ferny character is a native. He's just kind of a resident, not cool guy who ends up siding with Saruman and some of his spies and whatever. And then the southerner, the squint-eyed or slant-eyed southerner, gives the appearance of being a half-orc. And so you get the idea that he's probably also a spy that Saruman sent up there kind of in preparation for some of the things that he did. But that gets into another thing if you haven't read the book, The Scouring of the Shire, which I might have just spoiled if you haven't read the book. So, yeah, I'll do a video on that eventually too. Anyway, point being, there were these two characters, and of course, whenever Frodo has his accident, they leave. Aragorn points out, you've got enemies in this town. They're not everywhere, but they do exist, and you're going to need my help to get out of here because they're going to tell the people who will be able to catch and kill you where you go and how to get you. So he's kind of trying to explain all this, and Frodo's kind of questioning him, like, how can I trust you? I don't really know who you are. Aragorn is not letting on that he knows Gandalf at this point because he doesn't know, Frodo has never been told anything about him. At this point, Butterbur kind of busts in, gives him, Frodo that is, the letter that he was supposed to send him months ago from Gandalf. And the letter from Gandalf mentions the fact that he should look for Strider Aragorn, and he gives him the verse that, or at least the first few lines of the verse that Bilbo wrote for Aragorn, which of course is the all that is gold does not glitter rhyme that describes Aragorn himself. So he reads over this. He doesn't read it out loud because he doesn't want the other guy to know. He doesn't know who he is because the letter name's Aragorn, and he just knows this other guy is Strider. So that happens. Aragorn at some points lets loose a couple of the lines, and then Frodo realizes, oh, you're the guy that Gandalf was talking about? Why didn't you just say that sooner? And he's like, I didn't know you knew Gandalf or that Gandalf had told you, he knew that he knew Gandalf, but he didn't know that Gandalf had told him about him, didn't know that Gandalf had told Frodo about Aragorn, or that, he had any other way other than just, you just got to trust me, to get him to trust him. So there's a lot of actual interesting conversation there showing that A, Aragorn knows what he's doing, B, he's not just an idiot, and he's playing it in the way that he best knows how. It's an interesting dynamic going because you've got a lot of different factors going at the same time. Neither of them can really know who the other is or what the other knows, and then this letter just happens to pop in that solves all the problems, and that kind of resolves it all. Now, the interesting thing is, at the end of in the movie, of course, this all kind of ends with the Black Riders coming in to Bree, busting down the gate, and ultimately hacking up the beds. In the book, you actually get a little bit of precursor to that. They actually talk about the fact that you're not going to sleep in your rooms. We're going to go to this other room so that, if somebody does come in, they can find some fake stuff. They just kind of skip over that in the movie to trust you to get it yourself. But at that point, actually in the movie, they wake up when the attack happens. In the book, they wake up after they go in and they find that sure enough, it's all been hacked up. One of the other interesting differences between the book and the movie that I'll just point out really quickly too, in the book, the ringwraiths don't bust down the gate and then just, they don't do it in a violent way because part of what they're trying to do is be a little stealthy about how they're going about things. They don't want attention drawn to themselves. That's kind of a theme that you picked up by now in the book, but you never really get it in the movie. And the movie kind of ruins that dynamic. The whole idea behind the Black Riders is that their primary weapon is fear. They're not just out there to be kind of guerrilla warfare or something and just go in with guns blazing, so to speak. So that's just kind of an interesting aside I wanted to point out. But anyway, the main idea here is there's a lot going on in Bree and the Prancing Pony that the main plot driving elements get into the movie, but a lot of the interest of what goes on in Bree and a lot of the overall shift in tone of the story and even a lot of Aragorn's character is revealed in this one section of the book that just kind of gets skipped over in the movie because they're just trying to get the hobbits to Rivendell so then they can set out on the quest. So it's just a lot of interesting stuff going on, and I think it's really worth rereading the original version just because there's so much that gets left out in the movie, and it's so very different. So anyway, that's kind of the story of Bree from the original compared to the movie. So that ran a little longer than I expected. There's just a lot to go over in Bree and the Prancing Pony because there's just, Aragorn's character is so much more developed. Butterbur is a much more interesting character. There's just so much going on in Bree that just gets skipped that it's hard to talk about it all in a very short video. But I hope you learned something. I hope you found this comparison interesting. If you liked the video, please do like it, share. Please also subscribe to the channel, or if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do that at JRRTLore. And now for the Tolkien Lore channel, I'm signing out as the Tolkien Geek, and I'll see you next time. Namaste.